Hi, Music 103A students. Dr. Schultz here. Hope you're doing well. This is a video about voice leading from Chapter 5. And please do make sure that you read the chapter before watching the video, Chapter 5 in the textbook. Also make sure that you have read and studied this handout, the one called Rules of Voice Leading. And if you need a copy of this, I did hand it out in class, but if you need a copy of it, you can find it in Canvas as a file under week 9, under the module marked week 9. All right, to start off, let's just take a look at a voiced chord for 4 parts. Notice we're on a grand staff, treble clef and bass clef. And notice that we have different stem directions. Now, the stem directions have meaning in relationship to which voice it is. So in the bass clef, stems down in the bass clef is your bass part. Stems up in the bass clef is your tenor part. Stems up in the treble clef is your soprano part, and stems down in the treble clef is your alto part. Maybe you've heard that designation before in choir singing, SATB. That simply stands for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Please do keep the bass and tenor in the bass clef. Stems up for tenor, stems down for bass. And the soprano and the alto in the treble clef. Stems up for the soprano, and then stems down for the alto part. Now, when you have 4 voices, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, there are actually 6 different pairs of voices. Now, let me show you what that means. You can have a pair between the bass and the tenor, so looking at that pair of voices. You could also have a pair of voices from the bass and the alto. So in this example, the C and the E would be a pair of voices. You could also have a pair between the bass and the soprano, or in this case, the low C here and the higher C. You can also pair up the tenor and the alto, so the G to the E, or the tenor with the soprano, G to C, or the alto and the soprano. So there are 6 different pairs of voices to look at. So here are all the pairs written out with letter names. Bass tenor, bass alto, bass soprano, tenor alto, tenor soprano, alto soprano. 6 different pairs. Now, what you're really looking at is the interval distance between each one. And I know the book talks a lot about that. It's a little bit confusing because voice leading is really multidimensional. Not only do you have the up and down, the vertical, but you also have how this chord moves to the next one. So there's really, multiple things happening at the same time, a very spatial, multidimensional kind of process. Now let's take a look at the interval between all these 6 pairs, because that's really what you're looking for when you're looking for parallel octaves, parallel fifths, direct or hidden fifths or octaves, and all these different rules that we're going to be learning for Chapter 5. So between the C and the G, that's a fifth. And usually we don't care about the quality, so it's just a 5. Okay, what about between the C and the E here? So now we're looking at the bass and the alto. Well, C to E is a third. Now you might be saying, well, isn't that really a 10th? Well, it really actually is a 10th, but for the purposes of voice leading, we always condense the number down to its simple version. So C to E, we consider that to be just a third, simply a 3. It doesn't matter the octave. Same thing here, bass to soprano, even though that's 2 octaves, we're just going to say it's an octave, it's an 8. So the distance from here to here would be an octave. Then if you look from tenor to alto, G to E, that's a 6th, right? G, A, B, C, D, E. G to E is a 6. So there's a 6th between the tenor and the alto. And then between the tenor and the soprano, G to C is a 4. G, A, B, C. Now again, notice it actually is an octave plus a 4th, but we just consider it to be a 4 for the purposes of finding the voice leading airs. And then also the distance between the alto and the soprano, you can see is the interval of a 6th. Well, we'll come back to those numbers a little bit later when we talk about parallel octaves and fifths and consecutive fifths and octaves by contrary motion, unequal fifths, and then the direct or hidden fifth or octaves. But for now, I would like you to take a look at your rules of voice leading sheet. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through a lot of the rules on here, and I'm going to go into the textbook and show you the examples from the textbook for each one. Now, this handout, hopefully you find it to be very handy because it really is a summary of the rules from chapters 5 and 6 and so on. So it really is nice to have next to you. It's a single page reference for a lot of the rules and guidelines for voice leading from the chapters. Well, let's first talk about the range. So it says here, keep each voice in its characteristic range. Now the book has listed some ranges for us, and the way I think about ranges is in general an octave and a fifth for each one. So you can see the soprano is about C4 all the way up here to G5, an octave and a fifth. The alto is G up to D here. Now you can go a little bit lower. You could go down to an F for the alto sometimes, but in general you want to stay in these same ranges for your part writing. You want to keep the tenor between about C3 and G4. Again, an octave and a fifth. And then for the bass, this one I disagree with a little bit. I would probably go with F to C. It fits the octave and a fifth thing pretty well. Notice they gave you E to C. And that's okay. You can go down to the E if you'd like. Most singers that are male singers in like a high school choir probably wouldn't be able to sing that low. But you can write down to the E if you want to. Okay, so you want to keep each voice in its characteristic range. Okay, the next rule talks about spacing, and it says the upper three parts should stay within an octave of one another. In other words, there should be an octave or less between soprano alto, between alto tenor. However, there is no spacing restriction between the tenor and the bass. Let's take a look at the examples from the textbook. This is on page 76, example 5-8. Here in the first one, you can see the distance between the soprano and the alto is more than an octave. So that does not work. That's a spacing error. This one has more of an octave distance between the tenor and the alto. Now notice that the tenor and the bass are actually sharing the same pitch. That's what the stems up and down on the same note head mean. They're sharing the same D. So the bass and the tenor are singing the same pitch. But notice between this D, which is D3, and this F, which is F4, is an octave plus a third. Now, this one is very easy to see because they're on the same clef. But this one between the tenor and the alto is a little bit more difficult to see because the clefs kind of hide the air. But notice that is more than an octave. Now, that being said, an octave of space is okay. So it has to be an octave or less between soprano alto, octave or less between alto tenor. Now when it comes to the bass and the tenor, you can have as much space as you want. So you can see here, this is good. It has a G up to this B, which is an octave and a third away. So there is no spacing restriction between the bass and the tenor. The reason for that is because it sounds good. It actually mimics the overtone series, which starts with wide spaces on the bottom of the series and gets closer and closer together as you go higher on the overtones. So think of the spacing rule quite simply as between soprano alto, octave or less, between alto and tenor, octave or less of space, but between the bass and the tenor, there's no restriction. Some textbooks actually restrict it to an octave plus a fifth between the bass and the tenor, but our textbook does not have any restriction listed, so we'll go with that. All right, the next rule we're going to look at is called voice crossing. And this is to be avoided, just like a lot of these things that are on your rules of voice leading in bold. These are things that you're trying to avoid. So here, voice crossing should be avoided, for example, when the tenor is higher than the alto. Basically, what voice crossing says is that you want to have each voice in its characteristic order. So the soprano should always be the highest, the alto should always be the second highest, tenor second lowest, and bass the lowest voice. So you just want to maintain that order of voicings. So crossing actually applies to the up and down part, the vertical part. You can see here, this is example 5-6 on page 75. You can see here that the alto part is higher than the soprano, or you could see the soprano is lower than the alto. Now, of course, that's very obvious because you can see the stem directions don't look quite right. Same thing here in part B. Here you can see the bass is actually higher than the tenor, or the tenor is lower than the bass. So it's not really hard to pick them out between bass and tenor and soprano and alto, but it does become a little more difficult between the inner voices, the tenor and the alto. For example, here's a 5-7 on that same page 75. Notice here, this is the tenor part. The G is actually higher than the D and the alto. So the tenor is higher than the alto, or the alto is lower than the tenor. Now that is a voice crossing. Again, the voice crossing happens in the same up and down, the same vertical. You might be saying to yourself, well, this is real music. This is by Bach. And I always tell students, well, Bach can do that, but you can't. Okay, so for now, you want to avoid that. You want to avoid the voice crossing. Here, he's probably using it for a special musical effect, trying to bring out the tenor line to make it a little more melodic. But again, for us, for now, when we're first learning the system, we want to have all the voices in their characteristic order. Soprano always highest, alto second highest, tenor second lowest, bass lowest. So you can see here how the tenor is higher than the alto. That's a voice crossing. All right, the next rule is called voice overlapping. And this one is a little bit confusing. The wording is quite awkward, but I'll show you some examples on the staff in a couple minutes here. A couple of things about voice overlapping. First of all, this is not found in your textbook. So this is something that I brought to our voice leading method that's outside of the textbook, in addition to the textbook. The other thing that you should know about voice overlapping is that it occurs from one chord to the next. And we call those adjacent chords. So from one chord to the next. Remember, voice crossing occurred in the same chord, the same up and down spacing of that chord, the vertical part. Voice overlapping occurs from one chord to the next. Here's some examples of voice overlap. I just drew these up. They're not in your textbook. You can see in this first one, we're going from a G chord to a D chord. We're in the key of G major, presumably here with the 1 sharp in our key signature. And you can see here that the tenor, which goes B to F sharp, is going to a lower pitch than that just left by the bass. This is called a voice overlap. It's kind of similar to a crossing, but it's a little bit different concept because, again, it occurs with adjacent chords that are right next to one another. So again, you can see here the tenor is lower than the previous bass. That's a voice overlap between the bass and the tenor. The next one gives you a voice overlap between the soprano and the alto. Now notice here, the alto part goes from a D to a G. Okay, and you can notice that the alto here is higher than the previous soprano. Okay, so it's gone away with or upset the ordering of the voices in a certain sense from one chord to the next. It should also be noted that most of the rules and guidelines that we're looking at in chapter 5 only occur between adjacent chords that are right next to one another, like chord 1 to chord 2, but not chord 1 to 3, for example. We have a hard time remembering and understanding the relationship between chords that are having other chords in between them. So most of these rules apply to adjacent harmonies, chords that are right next to one another. Chord number 8 to chord number 9, for example. Now, a lot of times with voice overlap, I get the question, what if it's the same pitch? So you can see here in this example, the soprano has gone from a G to a D, and this D in the soprano is the same D the alto just left. And that's okay. You can actually have the same pitch in that way because it's not really overlapping. Okay. Again, to overlap, you have to have this occurring, tenor going to a lower pitch than that just left by the bass, or the alto going to a higher pitch than that just left by the soprano. You can also have this overlap occur between the tenor and the alto. I just didn't give you an example of that. Okay, so watch out for or avoid voice overlapping. All right, next we're going to talk about avoiding parallel fifths and parallel octaves. And again, this can occur between any pair of voices. So when we're looking at four-part style, remember that's going to be one of 6 pairs could occur. And you really have to be careful to look for all of the possibilities between all the 6 pairs. And I'll show you how to do that later. Now, parallel octaves and parallel fifths is a big one. Those are very common, and you want to stay away from them. Very common in students' voice leading, that is. So we're really trying to avoid them, and they're easy to write if you're not paying attention to what you're doing. This is on page 78, example 5-11. Now here we can see parallel fifths between the bass and the tenor. So look at here, the distance between bass and tenor, B to F sharp, is a fifth, right? And you can see how they're moving to another fifth. F sharp to C sharp is another fifth. And then they move back to the same pitches. So we have parallel fifths from here and from here. Now, this example is, in my opinion, not the best because a couple things. First of all, notice how the tenor really should have the stems going up, and the alto should really have the stems going down. The other thing that's often confused in this one is that notice that the bass part is also moving a fifth, right? It moves up a fifth, and the tenor part also moves up a fifth. But that's not really what you're looking at here to detect or to find the parallel fifths. What you're looking at is the distance between the two voices. So B to F sharp between the bass and the tenor is a fifth, and then in the next chord, there's another fifth between them. Now, you might remember that 2 parallel lines never intersect, right? And you can see that there's parallel motion happening here between these 2 voices, parallel fifths. All right, the next one shows us parallel octaves. This is part B. And you can notice the parallel octaves here are between the bass and the soprano. Notice between the bass and the soprano, we have an octave, 2 Bs. And they're moving to 2 F sharps. So we have an octave moving to an octave. The next example just shows you that parallel thirds, also parallel sixes by the way, are acceptable. So you can have parallel thirds and parallel fourths and parallel sixes, but you can't have parallel unisons, parallel fifths, or parallel octaves. A parallel unison is actually considered to be just like a parallel octave. We'll talk about that more later as well. All right, we're actually taking a little bit of a moment here to go back in the book. This is example 5-10. And what this example shows is the different types of motion that is possible between 2 voices. So notice here we have a soprano and alto voice, and we have 5 different scenarios, 5 different ways that that pair of voices can move. The first one's called static motion. There is no motion. Neither voice has moved. The B stays on the B, and the G stays on the G. The next one is called oblique motion. In oblique motion, one voice stays on the same pitch, here the soprano, and the other one moves to another note. So it could have gone the other way around. I could have kept the G and moved the soprano to another pitch. That would be also oblique motion. So oblique motion is where you have one voice remaining on the same pitch and the other one moves. Now, if you have static or oblique motion, it's very unlikely you're going to have one of these errors, simply because it doesn't involve some kind of parallel or similar motion, which is where most of the errors occur. The next possibility for motion types between 2 voices is called similar. In similar motion, both voices are moving in the same direction. Here they're both moving down, but the distance between them has been changed. So you can see here between G and B is a third, and between the D and the A is a fifth. They're both moving down. They're moving in the same direction, thus similar motion, but they're not parallel. If they were parallel, the number would be the same between them. In similar motion, the number's different, right? Here we have a third, here we have a fifth. In contrary motion rather, we have voices moving in opposite direction. So notice how the soprano moves up and the alto moves down. We have a third moving to a sixth. So the soprano moves up, alto moves down. Contrary motion is motion in the opposite direction from one another, right? You can also have contrary motion which goes inward. So for example, they could have had the soprano going down and the alto going up. So you can either go outwards or inwards. The last one here is parallel. And here we have parallel thirds. Notice between G and B there's a third, and between A and C there's also a third. And notice we don't care that's actually a major third and a minor third. We consider it to be still just a third going to a third. So we're really considering just the generic intervals here until we get to the fifths, and we'll talk more about that later. There's one called unequal fifths, which actually makes a difference between diminished and perfect. But for now, just know that the generic interval would still be considered parallel. Notice in parallel motion, they're moving in the same direction. They're both moving up, but the distance between them is the same. So in similar motion, the distance between them is different, moving in the same direction. But here, the distance between them is the same, parallel motion. So a third moving to a third, but they have to move in the same direction. All right, as long as we're talking about the different types of motion, I wanted to give you some hints and a little bit of direction when it comes to one of your homework assignments for this chapter. This is from the workbook, page 39, part A. And that's part of your homework for this week in chapter 5. So what it says is first, put lead sheet symbols in the blanks above the example, then analyze the motion between each of the pairs of voices and fill in the blanks using this system where ST is static, O is oblique, C is contrary, S is similar, and P is parallel. Well, you'll notice that I'm not going to have you do the first part, so don't worry about the pop chord symbols or the lead sheet symbols. We're really going to be looking here just at the motion between the voices. Now notice there are 6 examples because there are 6 pairs of voices, right? You can pair the bass and the tenor. You can pair up the bass with the alto, the bass and the soprano, the tenor and the alto, tenor and the soprano, and also the alto and the soprano. So there's 6 different pairs given 4 parts. Now, by the way, if there's only 3 voices, there's only 3 pairs. All right, so for this first example, we're looking at how the bass and soprano move from one chord to the next. So to do this, you might actually find it helpful to grab a couple different writing utensils and just kind of point to them. So here's bass, here's soprano. Notice they're an octave apart, so the distance between the bass and the soprano is an octave. And let's see how they move. The soprano stays on the same pitch, and the bass moves down to a G. And the distance between the G and the B flat, of course, is a third. So what happens when one voice moves and the other one does not? That's called oblique. Okay, then you just keep going. So between here, the bass and the soprano, the bass goes down and the soprano goes up. So if one goes down and one goes up, that's called contrary motion. Notice the distance between them. So between G and B flat is a third, and it's moving to a sixth, E flat to C. So here we have a third moving in contrary motion to a sixth. All right, keep going. The soprano part moves down, and the bass part moves up. So again, that's contrary motion. They're moving in opposite directions. Notice that we have a sixth moving to a third. Okay, let's also look at the distance between the bass and the alto and see how that voice is developing, that pair of voices. So between bass and alto, B flat and F is a fifth, right? Notice how the bass moves down and the alto moves up. That's contrary motion. And it's a fifth moving to an octave. A fifth to an octave. Okay, then the bass and the alto, we have the bass moving down and the alto staying on the same pitch. That's oblique, right? One voice moves and the other one doesn't. So we have an octave here, and then E flat to G is a third. Okay, and the last one, bass moves up, alto moves down. That's contrary motion. Okay, so again, bass is moving up, alto is moving down. Notice we have a third moving to an octave. All right, this is in the textbook, page 79, example 5-12. I just wanted to point out to you a couple of things that the book is saying about what is acceptable here in these examples. Notice that between the tenor and the soprano, there's an octave. Whenever there's an octave or a fifth, you really want to pay attention to see what the next distance is between those two pairs, between that pair of voices, because that's how you're going to find your parallels. But notice that they don't move, and they stay on the same pitches. That's static motion. If they don't move, that's acceptable. Even though you have an octave to an octave, you have to have motion in order for it to be a parallel. So static motion is fine. You can keep those C's the entire time. This next one points out a common flaw in finding parallels, and that is you always have to stay in the same pair of voices. So if you're looking between the soprano and the bass, you want to stay in the soprano and the bass. So you can see between the soprano and the bass there's a fifth, and it moves, that pair of voices moves in contrary motion to a third. But what they're saying is that if you did happen to think that this was a parallel fifth, C to G, right? And then G to D is a five. Notice how it's not a parallel fifth because the bass and the soprano is a fifth, and then the bass and the alto is a fifth. So in order to find that air, it has to be in the same pair of voices. So you have to stay between the bass and the soprano, or the bass and the tenor, whatever the pair happens to be. 6 possible pairs with 4 voices. And then this one points out the idea that parallel fourths are actually okay as well. So you can have parallel thirds and parallel sixths and parallel fourths, but you want to avoid parallel fifths and parallel octaves, and also parallel unisons. All right, we're going to look at something called consecutive fifths or consecutive octaves by contrary motion. And you can see here, it says avoid consecutive fifth or consecutive octaves by contrary motion. And this, again, is something to be avoided in any of the 6 voice pairs. This is the idea. Look at if you look at example 5-13, you can see here we have a parallel fifth between the bass and the tenor. So between A and E is a 5, they move in the same direction, and between D and A is a 5. So that's a parallel fifth. Now, what the book is saying, well, what if you put this A down an octave, and then the voice is moved in contrary motion? Is that okay to do that? And the answer is no. A consecutive fifth is very similar to a parallel fifth, has a similar sound, but it's just in contrary motion. So this is called a consecutive fifth by contrary motion, and you want to avoid it. You want to avoid that. So notice how we have a fifth between the A and the E, and then a fifth between the D and the A, but they're moving in contrary motion. So avoid parallel fifths, but also avoid consecutive fifths by contrary motion, or avoid consecutive octaves and consecutive octaves by contrary motion. All right, I wanted to give you a couple more examples of what a consecutive octave by contrary motion looks like. And this third example here is actually the one I'm going to start with. So notice between the bass and the soprano there's an octave. And the bass moves up and the soprano moves down. They move into another octave, G to G. So here we have an octave moving to an octave in contrary motion. This is to be avoided. That's an error. It's called a consecutive octave by contrary motion. Now, a lot of times what you'll actually get in real music is a unison going to an octave, or an octave going to a unison in opposite directions. So notice that here we have two Gs. One moves up and one moves down between the tenor and the bass. This unison, remember, is really considered to be an octave for the purposes of voice leading. So consider any unisons to be functioning like and acting like octaves in voice leading. So the G moving up to the C, the G moving down to the C, that's a consecutive octave by contrary motion. Even though I realize, of course, it's really a unison to an octave. Same thing here, if you have an octave moving inwards to another octave or unison, that is really the same thing as this, okay? So an octave moving to a unison is considered to be a consecutive octave by contrary motion if they move in opposite directions. By the way, if you have two voices doing something like this, so there the alto and the soprano are on the same pitch and they're moving up, they're both moving up, this is a parallel octave. It's also a voice overlap, because notice how the alto has gone to a higher pitch than the previous soprano. Okay, so parallel unisons are really considered to be the same as parallel octaves. So you can't write that either. Something to be avoided. All right, these next two rules are a little bit more tricky because they involve only certain pairs of voices. So let's start with the unequal fifth. Notice this rule, only an air between the bass and another voice. So it really involves three pairs, bass tenor, bass alto, or bass soprano. And it only involves this particular scenario where you have a diminished fifth going to a perfect fifth. Let's take a look at some of these from the textbook. This is example 5-15 on the bottom page 80 in the textbook. Notice here, between the tenor and the alto, we have a fifth. It's a perfect fifth. And then between the tenor and the alto, we have a diminished fifth, B to F. Now remember, there's going to be a diminished fifth that occurs between scale degrees 7 and 4 in every major key, or 7 and 4 in minor as long as you have the leading tone. So that is a naturally occurring diminished fifth tritone that happens in those keys, right, between scale degree 7 and 4. Now notice this is occurring between the tenor and the alto. So here we have a fifth, moving to a diminished fifth, moving to a perfect fifth. That's acceptable. It doesn't involve the bass. Remember, it's only a problem, it's only an error when you have a diminished fifth going to a perfect fifth with the bass. This next one is also okay because it shows a perfect fifth going to a diminished fifth. Notice here between the bass and the soprano we have a fifth, it's a perfect fifth, going to a diminished fifth. So that's also okay. But this next one is an error. Notice we have the bass and the soprano, which is a diminished fifth, moving to a perfect fifth. Right? B to F is a diminished fifth, tritone, moving to a perfect fifth between the A and the E. This is an error. This is called an unequal fifth, and you want to avoid those. So just to reiterate the rule and what it says, avoid unequal fifths, and that is when a diminished fifth goes to a perfect fifth with the bass. So you're looking between the bass and the soprano, bass alto, or bass tenor. All right, this last rule, direct or hidden fifths or octaves, is probably the most complicated of all the voice leading rules because it involves just a real specific scenario. First thing to point out here is that direct or hidden, two different names for the same thing. So a direct fifth and a hidden fifth are the same, or a direct octave and a hidden octave are the same thing. Now, a direct or hidden fifth or octave only occurs as an error between the bass and the soprano. So you're looking at the outer voices only, the bass and the soprano. And it occurs when the soprano leaps in the same direction into a fifth or into an octave with the bass. So there's really multiple things that have to happen for this air to occur. It has to occur between the bass and the soprano. There has to be a leap in the soprano. They have to move in the same direction, and at some other interval moving into a fifth or an octave. It's called a direct or hidden fifth or octave. Let's take a look at a couple examples from the textbook. This is over on page 81, example 5-16. Part A is a direct fifth, direct or hidden fifth. Let's see why. Remember that it has to be between the bass and the soprano. So here between the bass and the soprano we have a third, and then it moves to D and A, which is a fifth, right? So A to C is a third, D to A is a fifth. Now notice there is a leap in the soprano. Now for the purposes of definition, a leap, at least according to our textbook, is anything that's not stepwise motion. Stepwise motion would be like a G moving to an A or a C moving to a D. A leap is anything else. So if you have a C moving to an E, or a C moving to an F, or a C moving to a G, and so on, those are all leaps. Other books actually call a third a skip, but our book calls stepwise motion, notes that are right next to one another, and then anything else is a leap. So you can see C to A is a leap, and we have a third, A to C, moving to a fifth, D to A. Okay, part B is a direct or hidden octave. Notice between the bass and the soprano, we have C to E, which is a third. They're moving in the same direction. They're both moving up. And between the bass and the soprano, we have an octave, G to G. Notice there's a leap in the soprano part. The leap in the bass is irrelevant in terms of finding this air. Really, the best way to find the air is to look at all the leaps in the soprano part and see if the soprano is leaping into a fifth or an octave with the bass part. That's where you're going to find them. Part C is okay because it does not involve the bass and the soprano. So you can see here, between the bass and the alto, we have a third moving to a fifth, and that's acceptable because it's not between the bass and the soprano. The reason why they're avoided between the bass and the soprano is because you can really hear them more. You can hear them more readily because we tend to hear the bass and the soprano voices over any other parts in a 4-part texture because it's the highest and lowest. This last one is also okay because notice there is no leap in the soprano. There's stepwise motion into this octave. So here we have a G and a B moving to a C and a C an octave. So we have a third moving to an octave. But this is okay because there is stepwise motion into the soprano part here. It's only a direct or hidden fifth or octave if there's a leap in the soprano. Actually, this sort of thing happens a lot at the end of a piece of music near the cadence, near the 5-to-1 type cadence. This one in the key of C major. Okay, what we're going to do now is page 83 in the textbook. And so please do have your textbook open while you're watching the video here to page 83. And this is self-test 5-3, parts B and C we're going to take a look at. Now notice in part B, I've just copied my the music from the book onto a piece of staff paper here so we can see it a little more clearly. Page 83, part B. Find and label the following airs and examples, what the directions say. So we're going to try to find a parallel octave, a parallel fifth, a direct fifth, remember that's called a direct or hidden fifth, fifths by contrary motion, which are also known as consecutive fifths by contrary motion, and a spacing air. All right, let's see if we can find each one. First up, the parallel octave. Now, really when it comes down to it, what you want to do is go into every chord, the up and down part, find all your fifths and all your octaves, and see how they move into the next chord. That's how you're going to find most of your parallels. Remember that a parallel fifth, a parallel octave, and a parallel unison are to be avoided. For example, if you look at the first chord, and this is only for 3 voices, you can see that we have a bass, an alto, and a soprano. Between the bass and the alto, we have a third, right? D and F sharp. So you can really ignore that. Chances are there's not going to be an air there because there's a third. But now look at this. D to A between the bass and the soprano, notice that's a fifth. Okay, so you want to see how that moves into the next chord. So here D and A is a fifth, and the bass moves up to an E, and the soprano moves up to the B. Now remember to stay in the same pair of voices, right? So we're talking about bass soprano. So here we have a fifth moving to a fifth. Well, that's an air, right? That's a parallel fifth. We'll find our parallel octave in a moment. But that was, so we already found that one, parallel fifth. How to identify? What we want to do is draw a line between the pair of voices where the air occurs. So you see how I'm drawing attention to it? The D and the A is a fifth, and the E and the B is a fifth. They're moving in the same direction. And then you're going to label it with whatever number it is. In this case, the parallel fifth was number 2 from the book, right? So that's how you're going to know that you found the parallel fifths. So let's keep moving with that same process. In the next chord, we have a third here, so I'm going to ignore it. And then between E and B is a fifth. Let's see how that develops. The bass moves down, and the soprano moves up into a third. So that's okay, right? If it was a fifth to a fifth, then that would be a consecutive fifth by contrary motion. But because we have a fifth moving to a third, then that's acceptable. Okay, move to the next chord. Oh, by the way, we should also check out the third voice pair, which is the alto and soprano. So here we have a third moving to a sixth. And that's fine, right? Okay. Next chord, A and E is a 5. And they move in a similar motion to a third. So that's fine. And then we have a third moving to an octave. Now this is very close to the direct or hidden octave, but notice we have stepwise motion in the soprano. It only happens when there's a leap in the soprano. And then if you look between the alto and the soprano, we have a sixth moving to a sixth. Remember, it's the distance between the two voices you're looking at here. A sixth moving to a sixth. So that's fine. Parallel sixes are fine. Well, you would keep moving in this way to find the other parallel, the parallel octave. And so I'm just going to speed it up a little bit and search directly for the octaves. And if you look in the next chord, there's an octave between D and D, right? Between the bass and the soprano. Let's see how they move in the next chord. Remember to stay in the same pair of voices, right? The same bass and soprano. D and D moving to 2 Bs. Nope, that's a parallel octave. So again, to signify that you found it, draw a line between the pair of voices where the air occurs and label it with whichever one it was from the book. And that was the first air that they wanted us to find in the textbook, parallel octaves. Okay, so at this point, we still have to find a direct or hidden fifth, fifths by contrary motion, and a spacing air. Now I think you can see that the spacing air is pretty obvious. It's right here. Now to signify spacing errors in this kind of homework or exam, what I want you to do is draw a bracket between the two notes. So you see here, between the alto and the soprano is more than an octave of space. And the spacing error was number 5 in the exercise from the textbook. Now remember, the spacing error says you should have an octave or less between soprano alto, octave or less between alto tenor, and then between the bass and the tenor there's no restriction. Now if there is no tenor part, then that means there's no restriction between the bass and the alto. So like this is fine. Well, that's actually just a fifth, but this is also fine. An octave plus a third between the bass and the next highest voice. So that's your spacing error. By the way, in your homework, once you find one error, then you're done. You don't have to find more than one. So just find, there's only one example of each, typically in these examples. All right, now we need to find a direct fifth and fifths by contrary motion. Well, to find the direct fifth, the direct or hidden fifth, look for leaps in the soprano part. Because remember, that particular rule only involves the bass and the soprano, and it involves any other interval besides a fifth moving to a fifth in the same direction with the bass and soprano, and there's a leap in the soprano part. Okay, so let's check out for leaps in the soprano. stepwise motion, stepwise here. We already found an air there. No motion. Well, here's a leap. Let's check out that one. Bass and soprano third, leaping to a third, and that's fine. It's actually contrary motion anyways. There's a leap here. Oh, here it is, because notice how it leapt into a fifth. So let's take a look at it. Bass and soprano is a third here. Same pair, bass, soprano, moves into an octave. They move in the same direction, similar motion, and there is a leap in the soprano. So that right there is your direct or hidden fifth. Now the last one that we haven't found, which was air 4, is a fifth by contrary motion, also known as consecutive fifth by contrary motion. That one's a little hard to find, actually, in this example, but I'm going to show you where it is. It's actually right here. Keep in mind that this half note is still sounding here. Okay, it's being sustained, so it's actually still a part of the voice leading. Half note there, quarter notes above and below it. And you can see between the bass and the alto, we have a fifth, G to D, and they're moving to a fifth in opposite directions, right? The bass moves up and the alto moves down. So between G and D is a fifth, and between D and A is a fifth. So that's your consecutive fifth by contrary motion, also known as fifth by contrary motion in the book there. That's what they say. Or contrary fifths. So again, a little bit tricky. You want to make sure that this D, which is here in this chord, is also still in this chord. And it still counts as the part of the voice leading because it's a half note and you have quarter notes above and below it. So G to D is a 5. This one moves down, this one moves up. That's the contrary motion part. And D to A is also a fifth. All right, this example is also on page 83 of your textbook. It's part C, and you'll notice this one's actually for 4 voices. Again, I copied it on my own piece of staff paper here so we can see it a little more clearly. Notice in part C, we want to find parallel octaves, parallel fifth, a direct or hidden octave, octaves by contrary motion, an unacceptable unequal fifth, and a spacing air. So we're going to try to find those 6 airs in this passage. Now when you have 4 voices, things are a little bit more complicated because there are 6 pairs. In the previous example that we looked at, there's only 3 voices, so there's only 3 pairs, right? You can go bass alto, bass soprano, alto soprano. But when you have 4 voices, there are 4 pairs, right? Here's 1, here's 2, here's 3, here's 4, here's 5, and then alto and soprano will be the 6th pair. And you actually have to consider every pair of voices to find the airs. Now, it does sound a little bit complicated and time-consuming, and it can be, but once you get used to the process, you'll find that it's not so bad. And really, if you find the 5s and the 8s, the fifths and the octaves in each chord, and trace how they move into the next chord, you'll have pretty good success finding most of the airs. So for example, here's a fifth, right? A and E, and it moves to a third. So I'm going to disregard that, no problem. Here's an octave. This is an A, keep in mind. Shares a ledger line with the C sharp and the other voice. So we have 2 A's moving to a fifth. Now that's actually okay. You can have an octave moving to a fifth or a fifth moving to an octave. You just can't have an octave moving to an octave or a fifth moving to a fifth. Okay, between bass and soprano is a third, so I'm just going to ignore that for now. And then I'm going to go up to the next one. So I like to stick to it like this. You go this pair, this pair, this pair, and then this pair, and the final pair will be up here. So right now I'm going to look at the tenor and the alto. E to A is a fourth, and they're moving to a third. So that's fine. Got to stay in the same pair, right? And now tenor soprano, a sixth, moving in the same direction to a sixth. So parallel sixth is fine. And then the alto and soprano, a third, moving in similar motion to a fourth. that's fine. Okay, keep moving. Find your fifths and your octaves and see how they move into the next chord. Here's a third. I'm going to ignore that. Here's a fifth. How does that move? Well, it moves to a third. It's actually contrary motion, so no problem there. Here's an octave moving to a third. That's fine too. Let's see. This is a third, and this is a sixth, and this is a fourth. So I'm going to move on, only looking for fives and eights. Here's a fifth, moving to a third. That's fine. And let's see, there are no other, well, you do have to consider this as being an octave, remember? A unison is an octave, but it's moving outwards. The soprano moves up and the alto moves down. So it's an octave moving to a third. Okay, what about the next chord? Well, I see a fifth between here and here, moving to a fifth. So there's an air. We found one. Now, this might first appear to be a parallel fifth, but it actually is an unequal fifth. Take a look with the key signature. Key signature has three sharps. This is a G sharp to a D. So notice G sharp to D is a diminished fifth, and then A to E is a perfect fifth. So that actually is unacceptable unequal fifths. That was air 5 in this exercise. Now remember, that particular air only is an air when you have a diminished fifth going to a perfect fifth and it involves the bass. So it could be in the bass and the tenor, or the bass and the alto, or the bass and the soprano. Okay, and if you go into the next chord and find the octaves and the fifths, we have an octave here. Notice we're moving to a sixth, so that's fine. And there's a fifth here between bass and soprano. Moves to a third, so that's fine as well. Between here we have a third. There's a fifth here though, A and E. See that? Between the tenor and the soprano. And they're moving to another fifth. Oh, there it is actually. There's the parallel fifth. So here we have an A and E moving to a B and an F sharp. So do you see how by locating the fifths and the octaves in the vertical part and seeing how they move linearly or horizontally from one chord to the next, that's how you can find a lot of your airs. The parallel fifth was air number 2. Okay, next chord, we have D's octaves here between the bass and the alto. And look how they're moving to another octave. So that's your parallel octave. Remember, it has to be in the same voice pair, right? And again, these are to be avoided. These are airs. Octave to octave. That was air number 1. Okay, and we still need to find a direct or hidden octave, octaves by contrary motion, and a spacing air. So we're still looking for those. Now the spacing air this time is a little less obvious because it actually occurs between the tenor and alto. And remember, the clef difference can kind of hide it a little bit. Spacing air is actually here. Again, use that bracket. If you're going to tell me in words where it was, you would say measure 3, beat 2 between the tenor and the alto. You see how this E up to this E right here would be an octave, right? That's an octave plus a fourth. So you can see it's actually larger than an octave. So that's your spacing air. Now I'm going to go back and see if I can find the direct or hidden octave. To find the direct or hidden octave, you really want to search out the leaps in the soprano part. You want to see if the soprano is leaping into an octave or a fifth, in this case an octave, with the bass. So let's go back to the beginning. Here's a leap. This is a leap 2. Stepwise, stepwise, step, 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 leap, leap, step, step. So it's going to have to be in one of those leaps. Let's check out the first one here. between the bass and the soprano. Again, we're looking for the direct or hidden octave. Remember, that rule only applies to the bass and the soprano. And it happens when the bass and the soprano move in the same direction into an octave or a fifth, depending on if it's a direct fifth or a direct octave. So here we have an A and a C sharp, which is a third, moving to an octave, and there is a leap in the soprano. There it was, right away. And that was number 3. Okay, so again, the direct or hidden octave is when you have between the bass and the soprano an interval besides an octave, moving to an octave with a leap in the soprano, and they move in the same direction. Of course, if this was an octave moving to an octave, that's a parallel octave. This is called a direct or hidden octave. Very similar sound. All right, and then the very last air that we're still missing was the 4th one, and that says octaves by contrary motion. Now, if you go through all the chords and you find the fifths and the octaves, eventually you'll find it. But I just wanted to kind of go a little bit quicker here and show it to you. It's right here. And you see it's between the bass and the tenor. Here we have octave E's. Well, this is actually unison, but remember a unison is considered to be an octave. And they're moving in contrary motion to octave A's. So that was your consecutive octave by contrary motion, or simply what our book calls it is just octaves by contrary motion. All right, and for the last little part of this video, I just wanted to show you the whole example so you could see all 6 airs in there. Remember, when you're doing your homework that's similar to this from the workbook, you want to notate the airs in a similar way to what I did here. So draw a line between the voice pairs and label it with a number that corresponds to the air in the workbook. For the spacing air, just use that bracket between the 2 voices where the spacing air occurs on the up and down part. Also wanted to remind you that the best way to locate most of these airs is to go into every chord, the up and down part, find your octaves and your fifths in the 6 pairs that we talked about, and see how they develop into the next chord. Also remember that you have to stay in the same pair of voices to find the air. So if you go from, say, like bass to tenor, and then the next one you're saying it's between the bass and the alto, nope, that's not where it is, because you did not stay in the same voice pair. So if you're looking between the bass and the tenor, stay in the bass and the tenor. All the airs will be in the same pair of voices.